Welcome to Snohomish Real Estate Insider, your go-to real estate podcast for agents, buyers, sellers, and investors. We dive into market trends, expert insights, and actionable strategies to help you succeed. Whether you're growing your business or making informed decisions, we've got you covered. Let's get started. Here's your host, Kevin Wick.
All right, so welcome to the Snohomish Real Estate Insider. I'm here today with Blake, and Blake is here to talk a little bit about appraisals because you are a appraiser. So what's the title? What's your title?
I'm a certified real estate appraiser.
Certified real estate
I do
appraiser.
residential.
So you know what? Actually, why don't you just introduce yourself and talk about your little bit of background?
My name's Blake Rehbein. I am a real estate agent as well as an appraiser. I grew up in Minnesota and moved out to Washington because of the Navy. And I have been out here for, like about 20 years.
Now, were you in the Navy?
I was.
I did not know that
There's
about
lots
you.
of seaman jokes that I forgot about out there about Navy
imagine.
guys. Yeah. So yeah, but yeah, in the Navy, and got married, had a kid, ended up getting divorced, but stayed out in Washington to be with my kid. So I just started a life out here because it's a lot more beautiful here than in Minnesota as far as the mountains.
It's more rugged.
The ocean.
Absolutely.
There's a lot more opportunity out here as well.
Yeah. So now, how long have you been an appraiser for?
I've been an appraiser for about 5 years. Yeah.
And then what about a real estate agent?
About 8.
8.
Yeah.
Excellent. And what made you want to go from real estate into appraisal or while you're doing real estate?
Honestly, I got a really bad appraisal on my own house for a HELOC, and not a HELOC, but a refinance. And so I was gonna get money to be able to go full-time real estate. I was trying to get out of construction because I was doing construction and real estate sales. And the guy just came in at a really bad number. Nice. And so I thought, well, I could do this. And so I looked into it. I saw that there was a lot of opportunity. And then the thing that I love about sales is actually running the numbers on the house, the comparables and whatnot. So it fit right up my alley to dive into that. And I was so used to being dual career that if I could be down in a ditch 20 feet down in the ground selling real estate, I thought I should be able to appraise and sell some real estate, so.
Well, that's great.
That's how that came to be.
I imagine it's probably an advantage for you to be an appraiser as well as a real estate agent. Would you?
Yeah, yes and no. You think starting off right away it is, and so at least for me, I would lean into it, and then I did a good job of explaining to the clients out there in public that, well, this isn't an appraisal you're getting. They would be wanting me to list their house.
Right.
And I would say that I'm an appraiser, and then it could confuse them. And so
I never even thought of that.
Yeah. And then also as an appraiser, we're looking at different things. So like as a salesperson, you're wanting to sell the house for as much money. So you're focused on obviously the marketing and getting it set up right. And if somebody's willing to overpay for it, that's fantastic. Now, does it get to the finish line? I don't know. But you're at least setting the table to get the most amount of money.
Right.
Sometimes as an appraiser, it can be a negative where you're really looking at the appraisal criteria and then you're playing it more safe instead of really giving it a chance to run up in the market.
So, and that just goes to the reality of real estate is a real estate agent's looking for market value where an appraiser is looking for appraised value. And so let's talk a little bit about what does the appraised value look like, and then we'll talk about what the market value looks like.
Okay, so I just went through a pretty heavy scenario on this, so I'm pretty up to speed with it now with an underwriter. There's really two parts to the appraisal. So I go out and I am looking at what sort of features there are, what the data on the home. What is the actual home?
Yeah.
Then I go back to the office and I'm looking at other homes and putting together a puzzle essentially. Now, when I'm looking at it, I'm hired by the bank essentially to go out there to review what the collateral's worth. It can be fairly difficult in the market that we've been in because there's such low inventory.
Yeah.
So then what ends up happening is the market's driving the price up. The market is the one that's determining the actual market. I don't make the market as an appraiser. I just merely interpret it.
Yeah.
So it can get a little dicey when there's really low inventory and high demand. And then you're starting as an appraiser to maybe look at different characteristics of a home and of sales, maybe more recent sales, as opposed to a more similar criteria home like you would in a more balanced market. You would focus more on physical characteristics of the house.
Okay.
So when a home is being looked at after I turn a report in, now the underwriter and the review appraiser, they're simply looking at collateral risk, and that's it.
Yes.
So they're even looking at a different level of criteria than I am,
Right.
even as an appraiser.
So they're I'm not going to say they're your boss, but they're the ones that are really analyzing it. And they're the ones that, basically the agents, when they're getting mad, they need to get mad at the right person. It's not typically the appraiser. Usually it's not the appraiser that's having the issues with things.
So it would look to you as the appraiser, because what happens after I turn an appraisal report in, then they're reviewing it. And so they, as in the review appraiser, they're simply looking at risk. Right. And so they're not concerned so much about maybe what I'm looking at within the market, because I know the local market. Now, this review appraiser, they're likely from a different state, so they don't even know.
Right.
And I don't think there's any way to really get around that. I think nowadays all these companies are going to have people working from different states. So I don't. The reality is, they only care about risk, and that's it. They could care less if there was 5 offers. They could care less about any of the market conditions, especially if they don't understand it. And so they may put a condition on the appraisal, like a revision for me to make. I might make something subject or as is. They may want me to change it to subject to.
Okay.
And so at the
Give
end,
an example of that, because I understand the difference between as is and subject to. But what would something be subject to?
Let's do something basic.
Okay.
Let's say there's a deck and there's like a 2.5 foot drop off or 2 foot drop off, and it's fine. It doesn't really need a railing. The underwriter might require there to be a railing. They say, well, that looks unsafe. And then you could say, well, it's only this distance, it's not required. But at the end of the day, if the underwriter really pushes back, they're the ones signing off on the loan.
Okay.
So I'm merely just a subcontractor, essentially,
Right.
as an appraiser. And so then now the agent could be looking at that and say, well, this stupid appraiser, what's he doing? And so it could be coming from someone other than the appraiser. And the appraiser is merely the messenger in that case. So it's not always on the appraiser, and the appraiser can be overruled by an underwriter. If they don't like a report, if it's pushed up too far up, they could say, look, this doesn't look right. We're going to order another appraisal. There's all sorts of scenarios. But at the end of the day, a lot of it, from what I'm starting to learn, can also come down to the borrower, which is important for real estate agents to understand. Because if the borrower is already high risk because of their current economical situation, and now that high-risk person is now putting in an offer and wins on a high-risk property, that could potentially be a disaster. It could go through, and it could also come falling apart as the underwriter rips everything apart. And so that's a real thing.
Yeah, absolutely. So, well, what else would you like to add in regards to, the aspects of an appraisal?
I think at the end of the day, I think most appraisers are trying to do good work, and however, they're just people, and so people make mistakes. And so if I was an agent and I knew that I had a difficult property, to be able to get the valuation that a borrower seemed to think was there and the seller seemed to think was there, so you're at a contract price.
Yeah.
I would definitely be taking the offensive strategy and reaching out to the appraiser before they come out and asking them for the email and just sending them the comparables that you use to price the property or to accept that offer. It's a lot better than trying to get an appraiser to change their mind after they made up their mind.
Yeah.
You see what I'm saying?
I do. So take the collaborative approach and actually, I love that proactive approach to that. That's smart.
Yeah. And I think the amount somebody's putting down, it's not going to matter so much to the appraiser because that's not something we look at. But once again, that's that second layer of that underwriter looking at it. And so,
well, that's just the nature of the business. I mean, if somebody's putting 50% down, there's a high probability they're not even going to get an appraisal. And so, just because they're not worried about value, because they know the value's there because they've got 50% equity in the property.
Yeah, and I just learned, I was on an appraisal inspection, and this guy worked for a bank and was a part of the. He did risk assessment for locking loans. Okay. So numbers guy, right?
Yeah.
Well, at the end of the day, I never understood what happens to loans when, lenders, some can hold their own paper. However, he explained to me that, obviously banks can do that because they're in the business of loaning and they keep their loans on hand. But these mortgage brokers, even if they have money to spend and there's money there, he said it gets eaten up really quick if they're having to buy back loans. So even though a lender can service their own loans, because you'll hear lenders say that, we can service our own. What ends up happening to those, so the scenario I'm discussing where an underwriter maybe lets a risky deal go through, and then it might not pass the sniff test on the secondary market, and so that lender is required to buy back the loan. So if it's a $600,000 loan, now they have to go buy it back. So they pay $600,000 and it kicks back to them. And so the market that they're left with to get rid of that is 80 cents on the dollar.
Wow.
So they're losing money by doing bad deals.
Yeah. So that's why it's so important to have that second layer after the appraiser turns in the appraisal to have the reviewer to come in and look at it to make sure that it's a solid deal.
Right.
And because the secondary market is coming in, analyzing it even further.
Right.
Which then could...
It can kick back after the sale already happened.
Yeah.
We've seen it happen a year later.
Right.
So buyers in the house, everyone's happy but the lender.
Yeah.
They lost money.
Wow.
And so that's why there's so much scrutiny on the appraisal side. That's why there's so much to look at. And so none of this stuff matters on the easy houses that a fifth grader could price, Like I have a listing in the Berry Farm. It's easy.
Right.
A little difficult because there wasn't any recent comparables, but you look at all last summer, there's a bunch of them or anything like that. I don't think anybody's going to have any sort of issues. And if they do, that's fairly easy to argue. Like if there's a bunch of evidence to show that the value's there, that's a simple exchange of information to get the appraiser to change the value. Because back to the thing about them making mistakes, honestly, we are guided by due dates, and the workflow is never smooth.
Not consistent.
Never.
Yeah.
It's like feast or famine. And so right now what we're dealing with is there's a lot of low volume. So the lenders have gotten used to asking for ridiculous turn times.
Wow.
And then appraisers don't have a lot of work, so they accept it. But then if they get busy, they don't want to decline it or accept with conditions. If you accept with conditions, it could go away, and then you don't have it.
Yeah.
So they're constantly fighting. We're constantly fighting due dates. And so somebody could be tired. They could pull one or two comps and all of a sudden form an opinion. It's there, it's not there. And they put together a report based on what they thought they saw. So that's why it's important on the difficult ones to really do the homework for the appraiser, to give them the story of what it is you're selling and here's why it's worth that. Mm-hmm. And the worst thing an agent can do is just hand something bigger and say, well, mine's just a little bit smaller, so it's totally there, the value.
Yeah.
That's the worst. So like if it's totally there, then provide a comparable that's smaller that will come up to your price. You can't just pull bigger, better stuff and just say, well, it's there. Because that doesn't work for the bank.
Right. So you've got to bracket it is the bottom line.
Essentially, yeah. And there's no hard steadfast rules. Like we can't just go ignore comparable properties to pick other ones to paint a picture. You have to look at the characteristics of the property. You have to look at the most recent sales, as well as, you can go back a year, no problem. We can even go back beyond a year, but you still have to have something recent. Mm-hmm. If you're pulling that far back, there's got to be a reason, which is the case in a lot of these difficult types of properties to figure out. You're going back, a year. You're if you're doing a manufactured home on some acreage, it's not uncommon to be 5 miles away plus on some stuff. You know, you got to have something close, but then when you're dealing with low inventory, you just have to use common sense. That's what I'd say as an agent, is just use common sense and understand that the appraiser has to find something essentially worse to come up to your value, and then find something better to come down, and then that sandwiches it for the reader who's in a different state most likely. They're just looking at it. They've never seen any of that, and they have to make sense of it and sign off on it and say, yes, this looks legitimate.
Yeah.
So it can't look legitimate if you're missing a piece of the puzzle.
Right.
And so if you've brought every piece of the puzzle other than the missing piece and you can't figure it out, then you can't get mad at the appraiser when they come up with something different, because you never even knew what that piece was.
Yeah.
So it happens a lot on smaller properties. Stuff that is, 900 square feet, you start to get into trouble. When there's low inventory, you got to look at what is 900 square feet and less. Is it coming up to where you're at? If it's not, you're going to have trouble.
Yeah.
You know, we like to stay within 20% ideally of size. So if you're 900 square feet, add 180 square feet onto that, you're coming up to 1080. You can't be grabbing stuff that's 1,200 square feet.
Yeah.
And saying, well, mine's just a little bit smaller, but it's redone. It's nice.
Yep. I'm sure you hear that all the time.
Yeah, and I get it. It kind of makes sense, but you have to understand it from the perspective of the lender, and that's what it is. And so I think that's what would make a good agent, and when you're selling a house or helping someone buy, is really understanding the homes, really understand what it is you're looking at, and at the end of the day, you have to realize it's just the opinion of the appraiser. And some agents will say that in a derogatory way, say, well, it's just an opinion. I would say that it's a fairly qualified opinion.
Right.
And so although it's an opinion, and if you were to get 3 appraisers on a really difficult property, you're definitely going to come up with 3 different numbers. there's going to be a range.
But what's important to realize, that opinion carries a ton of weight in a transaction. That's the bottom line. That's why it's so important to do your research and provide it, and to be a team player in that. And so,
absolutely,
it's very important. So now let's transition. Just have a quick conversation over. Okay, so now we figured out what appraised value is. How you come up with appraised value. Now, from a market value standpoint, what do you do differently from a market value? And how do you talk to your client to get them to understand the difference?
The way I do it, just through failing forward, is I definitely segment the two for sure. So what it would look like is, here's what the comparables show. Here's what this house could potentially appraise for that I'm seeing. And once you have that bracket, you can still sell the house for more than that. Mm-hmm. You could be selling to someone for cash. Somebody could offer to bring more cash to the table. So that's the part that, where being an agent, having your agent hat on, is super important, because what if you dial in the landscaping? What if there's not a whole lot on the market? What if it's just the right neighborhood where a lot of people want to be there? If you understand where the bracket stops for the appraiser, now you understand how much cash you need that buyer to bring to protect your seller. Mm-hmm. Or if you're willing to gamble, and you don't have a 2280 to cover the gap, then at least your seller knows, hey, appraisal's probably going to come in somewhere around here.
Yeah, what's the 22AD? Why don't you explain what that is really quick?
22AD is the form where buyers agree to pay over appraised value of a certain dollar amount.
So they're bringing in additional down payment to cover that
Correct.
difference. Because if it appraises for $1 million and you've made an offer of $1.1 million, you're going to have to bring an additional $100,000 to the table. So
to make that 1.1. Yeah.
Right.
So if you, exactly. So if you were to look at it and say, wow, this thing will only appraise for $1 million, and this person has offered 1.1, however, they're only willing to cover a $50,000 gap, then if they don't have any more to offer, they're already offering to pay $50,000 more. Then I think if you don't have a better offer, then the right thing to do would be to talk to the seller and let them know that it's going to be difficult for this to appraise for $1,050,000 based on what you're seeing. However, it's an opinion of value. We'll see what the appraiser comes in at. But however, there's potential. There could be, that won't appraise for that much, and that's a lot better than a seller thinking they're going to get 1.1, having the appraisal come in, and then there you are, 2-3 weeks into the transaction, and now you're having to renegotiate.
Right.
And so if you've got a buyer who can't pay any more, I mean, is it going to benefit you to go back on the market to find someone to once again pay more for the property? And so I think that's why it goes into the homework up front and who you're accepting. And at that point, if you've already looked at the comparables and it came in where you thought it would, mm-hmm. there's really nothing to argue about.
Right.
At that point, you're basically selling the house for whatever it appraises for plus the 50.
Yeah.
So I do think it's important to pay attention to what the appraiser's looking at and understand your comparables, because it does make for a smoother transaction.
Mm-hmm. I agree. Well, it's definitely clear. You definitely know what you're talking about, which I absolutely appreciate. I know I've had you answer a few questions in the middle of our sales meetings, which has been beneficial, and I appreciate it. I appreciate you taking the time with us today.
No problem.
Why don't you go ahead and just tell us how to get in touch with you if you're looking to buy or sell real estate and you're looking for a good agent. Blake is definitely a great person to talk to.
Yeah, just show up to the Mill Creek office.
You're always here. Absolutely.
I'm here often.
And what's your phone number?
425-330-0407.
And your email address?
BlakeRehbein@gmail.com.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much, Blake. I appreciate the time that we have today, and we'll do this again. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
All right.
Thanks for tuning into the Snohomish Real Estate Insider podcast. Tune in next week for more market trends, expert insights, and actionable strategies. Make sure to like and subscribe so you never miss an episode.